All right, folks. Hang on here. Gotta get something set up. It was working, now it's not. All right, we'll see how this all goes. All right, welcome to Lookout. Got some little technical sound issues going on here, but I think I'll figure them out. I want to talk tonight about the Klamath Mountains, and Park Fire's not doing a lot right now. Sounds like it's been holding as far as we know through today. Crozier Fire is kind of wrapped up, and the fire that was in Redding, same deal. So we're going to talk a bit about the fires in the Klamath. If you're just joining us for the first time, this is Lookout Livestream. My name is Zeke Lunder, and we do broadcasts from Chico. It's Lookout Media on fire history, fire tactics, how wildland firefighting works, tell some stories. We look at data. We kind of try to give you guys a big picture on forest fires, forestry, and try to cut through some of the BS. I've been trolling Facebook, looking for things, which I hate doing, and there's so much garbage on there about so much opinion about the solutions and so much kind of data-free information. Just the politics and really frustrating stuff. Arguments about nothing. So we're hoping to cut through a lot of that and tell you some stories that are based in reality and experience, and connect you with people that know what they're talking about, and give you some real information. So, hi everyone, thanks for joining. I'm going to show a video today, but I'm going to have to figure out something about how it's is or isn't, sound isn't working for it. So we'll jump right into some maps here. Perch Fire, let's see, okay, we're talking about the Boise Fire, which is happening over here by Orleans. So because we're talking about the Klamath Mountains, we're going to kind of zoom out a bit here and turn off some layers. Just kind of give you the big picture view real quick. Klamath Mountains are kind of everything between Crescent City. This is the Oregon-California border at the coast. Here's Arcata and Eureka down here. Yep, just like that, like a big drain. Eureka, Redding. So when we talk about the Klamath Mountains, we're kind of talking about like everything from Redding to Crescent City and from I-5 to the ocean. It's kind of a loose definition. It includes the Trinity Alps. Whiskey Town is kind of on the edge of it. It's kind of, the Coast Range in California kind of dies out when you get up to about Highway 36. And then north of that, you've kind of got the Klamath Mountains. So it's not real, there's no like, I guess a geologist would tell you where the hard edge is, but to me, the Klamath Mountains is kind of everything between I-5 and the coast in Oregon, down to about Highway 36, maybe 299 if you're splitting hairs. But it's kind of like our chunk of Idaho. You know, like if you look at, it's just as far as talking about where people live and where the wilderness is. Everything else, if we look at like a map of structures in California, Northern California is pretty sparse, but you see, there's a lot of people live on the coast, and a lot of people live along kind of 299. You got Weaverville, you got Shasta Valley, or Scott Valley here, Shasta Valley. Down here, you got really not much. So there's some structures out here that are like little cabins. A lot of the things that are showing up here as structures might not be anything there at all. So if you zoom out and look at kind of the whole state, even by Northern California standards, the Klamath is very sparsely populated, and includes some of the biggest roadless and wilderness areas in the state, including the Marble Mountain Wilderness, Russian Wilderness, Siskiyou Wilderness. And so most of the people out here live on the rivers along Highway 96, which runs from Wairika down through Happy Camp down to Orleans, ends up at Willow Creek. And 96 is really a forgotten highway. So another thing about the Klamath Mountains, if you look at kind of the watershed of the Klamath River, is this is Karuk Indian country. The Karuk people Karuk means upriver, and Yurok means downriver, and so the Yurok Nation is kind of here from the mouth of the Klamath River up to like Wichipec and includes Hoopa. But right around here between Wichipec and Orleans, you kind of go into the Karuk country, which is spelled K-A-R-U-K, Karuk, but pronounced Karuk. So yeah, Karuk country kind of is just like a couple million acres in here. And one of the interesting things about the Karuk people is they were never really conquered by Spaniards. Like Spaniards kind of laid waste to native people as far where they got to, but they couldn't really get into this country. They weren't hardy enough explorers, I guess, to really get in here and conquer the Karuk people. So the Karuk people, their first contact was actually with like Scottish fur trappers. And so to this day, a lot of folks in this country have names like Tripp or Preston or Conrad. Going back to the Scottish influence. So we've talked a lot about the Klamath on here. The Klamath is it's its own country in a lot of ways, and people here have their own stories about fire. They go back to the beginning of time, and a lot of the white folks who've settled out there also have learned those stories and have learned a lot about fire from being in the place and learning from the native people. So kind of the theme of this program is new stories about fire, because I think we're all tired of the old story about fire. The old story about fire is what you see anytime you turn on the TV news, where there's always, if you read a book, if you picked up a novel and every time you picked it up it had the same victims, the same kind of villain and the same hero, you'd probably get sick of that genre, right? And so our fire genre, as far as the mass media goes, is we got victimized residents mercilessly run out of their place by the villain fire and protected by the heroic firefighters, and it's over and over. And there's got to be some new stories about how fire works and how we get along with fire and who the heroes are. So that's the theme for tonight, and we're going to frame that through the Klamath and the fire history of the Klamath. So I spent some time today making some data for this, and this is the fire history of the Klamath Mountains. So we're going here from 299 up to Happy Camp. And we can see there's a lot of places out here that have burned. Like, we'll just kind of go back and start from, the data is really incomplete. And I think one thing that's interesting about, so if we look at this 1800s, late 1800s to 1930s, in a lot of ways this is probably a map of cultural burning, right? Like, white people showed up and they started putting out all the fires and they started drawing them on maps. And native people continued to use fire and burn as they always had. And so A lot of these old historic fires from pre-1930s are likely burns that were done by people who had lived there forever, who'd been burning for thousands of years. So then starting in the 30s, we kind of going through a rainbow here from red to orange to yellow. We didn't have a lot of huge fires here in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. Started to have some big fires here in the 70s and 80s, especially in the 80s. And this is kind of a lot of firefighters of my generation. They're kind of their first experience, or the people who were my mentors, was like the 1987 lightning bust in the Klamath. And it was kind of nuclear winter over there, and people suffered greatly. So in the 90s we have some more big fires, and then in the 2000s we really start to pick up some. It's kind of like a repeat of like the 87 fires. It's like 2008. 2010s we had some really big fires, the Happy Camp Complex being one of them, the Salmon River Complex fires. And then in the 2020s, it's continued, right? So, a unique part of the story here is just how we talk about filling in the puzzle pieces. And so, the landscape here has been fragmented by frequent fire, and you can't really have what we talked about the other day was how the Dixie Fire burned 1 million acres, mainly of land that hadn't had big fires for 100 years. So you don't really get you're not going to get 1 million acre fire in the Klamath, because it's going to burn, here, and it's going to be surrounded by other recent fires that are going to help contain it. So in the case of the Boise Fire that we're going to talk about tonight, Boise's about 1,500 acres when this was taken, and then we've got kind of an infrared map of where it's hot, and the whole interior is kind of hot, and then extreme kind of heat around the edges. But what we see right off the bat is that this fire is largely contained by a fire that happened last year, a fire that happened 4 years ago, and a fire that happened 11 years ago. So these fires aren't going to actually like completely extinguish the fire, but they kind of right off the bat limit the potential. So if we look at kind of the area that it has that it can burn in that hasn't burned recently, it's maybe 25, 30,000 acres. So we talk a lot about fires filling in the puzzle pieces. So there's a good story to tell here. Every one of these fires has a story to tell about it, and why the line is where it is, how they decided to put the line there, how hard they fought at the beginning to keep the fire small before they gave up and went to a big box. The effects of the fire, there's kind of no end to the narrative of like, okay, this fire in 2013 was affected by fires from this area burned in 2006, right? So the 2013 fire didn't really move very well into that fire, right? You can see what even happened there. So the 2013 Butler fire, 2006 Soames fire, they came in. So firefighters don't like leaving dirty edge on the line, right? So this fire basically got to the drainage, the Butler Creek drainage, and stopped. Like, it wasn't really moving into this burn. But the firefighters came and they lit a backfire down this ridge, so they could say it was contained. They want to mop it up. And then the conditions were so mild that this fire in the 7-year-old burn, it didn't even really carry, except where they lit it with torches and ping pong balls and whatever else. So that's the story here, is that the previous fire helps contain the next one. So here we have the Perch Fire that burned last year in this kind of blue. And what's this other one here? And this other area here that Perch burned in the 1950s. So there's a lot of discussion about like, how long is a burn scar good for? How long will it contain the next fire before it's grown up enough that it won't do that anymore. But you can see that perch pretty much also ran into Butler. Perch burned fine in the Stomi Fire of 2006, 17 years later, but it kind of went out when it hit Butler. So we expect kind of similar things. It's like, well, perch went out when it hit Butler. What's going to happen when this fire hits Butler? Now, it's not like this fire just hit that fire and there was no firefighting. But what we see in this country over and over and over is that firefighting is often not effective if you're doing it in a place that hasn't had a fire recently. And that working on the edge of another fire that's even like 15 years old often brings the advantage that you need to catch a fire. So what's going on right now on Boise, I haven't got a lot of great intel, but it's spreading well in this area that hasn't burned for over 100 years. And they hit it really hard with the initial attack and it escaped, and they know that they're not gonna send crews in and go direct on this fire, uphill this fire. Now, if this was Cal Fire and this was private timberland, they would be putting crews in here, very likely. And for a long time, this is a little, I think, maybe taboo. But hang on a second here. Whenever I say that, I gotta check myself, right? This Karuk media thing is for something else. One thing about Cal Fire crews in the past was they were all inmates, and inmates didn't have a lot of say in their assignment. It was hard for an inmate crew to say, no, that's dangerous, we're not going to do it. And so hence Cal Fire's used crews in some extremely hairy circumstances where hotshot crews would say, no, we're not going in there. Now Cal Fire's crews are largely paid firefighters because of all the prison camps closing. But just cultural difference between Cal Fire and Forest Service. Forest Service they've learned a lesson here, and they're not going direct on the headless fire uphill of it. So they have to come up with a plan of how they're going to use the recent fire landscape to contain this fire. And while they're at it, they want to have a plan that maximizes the benefits of fire, right? So if they can come in right now and start dropping ping pong balls from a drone that are full of flammable liquid, potentially they can get out ahead of this and they can start backing fire down off this ridge ahead of it. And that will reduce the likelihood that the fire gets down in the bottom here and burns out of here with that kind of Mill Creek style head fire, standard placing, highly destructive effect. So I want to talk a bit about prescribed fire here, and also I talked a little bit yesterday about the perch fire last year and how the Karuk Tribe and other local folks steered a strategy that kind of defined the timing of how this got lit, and then we'll look at some imagery too of the fire effects from that. But first I want to talk a bit about burning in this country. And we've been going over here for about the last 12 years to help run the Klamath River treks. And when I'm talking about kind of us developing new stories around fire, like we see all these pictures of big flames and scary action, and I think we need to reclaim some of that narrative. And here, like, this is done on purpose, right? Like, we're doing this, we're lighting off this road in October on purpose in an area that burned in 2008, because this is right next to town. This is right next to the town of Orleans, and it was full of snags and all the dead and down from the fire that was that had happened 9 years before. And it's a menace. It's a danger to the town. And so we did this to clean it up. And so then, like last year when we had the fires that were up the hill from Orleans, there was a lot less to worry about in Orleans because we weren't worried about like this stuff burning on the hottest day of July because we'd burned it in October. This is 2017. But we think a lot about prescribed fire being these like little flames and kind of just licking through the pine needles and burning the oak leaves. And it doesn't have to be that. It can be way more dynamic. And one thing that made this possible to burn at a higher severity here is that we'd already burned a lot around here in a strategic way. And we're kind of finishing up a week of burning here after we've already burned the places that a fire here could get away to. So this is all, when we were burning this in 2017, the sun went down and it was dramatic. And you could hear people in town just like yelling, dogs barking, and people are just like, yahoo! It was like it was a Friday night or something. And as the sun went down and the whole mountain's on fire behind town, people were stoked. People were just, partying in town, watching the mountain burn. And so if I get this video to play that I want to play from the Karuk Tribe, they talk about, people in this town aren't afraid of fire. Like they love fire and they know because they've been exposed to this story, right? Like it's not all fear. It's there can be a lot of joy in like taking care of your place and doing it big, right? So last year when it came time to for the community to be involved in steering the tactics of the fire, they weren't coming at a place from fear. They're coming at it from a place of like, we're glad that this is burning right now because we just had some rain and we'd much rather have this happen and burn behind our homes after some rain in September than have it happen in July on a windy day, right? So when we're talking about kind of the context now of how the Boise Fire is going to unfold and what makes it interesting, part of it's the culture. Part of it is the fact that folks over here have been organizing around putting fire on the ground for decades. And also that they've had funding from CAL FIRE, from the Forest Service, from Nature Conservancy. They've pulled in millions of dollars of funding to become more fire literate. Now, like I said, the Klamath is its own nation, it's its own country, it's its own reality, right? But there's a lot to learn. And, if you want to go learn about how this all works, you can sign up and go to their treks in October. Anyway, this was, for me, is eye-opening, is burning at that scale. And, a lot of us would look at an image like this and think like, oh my God, this is so destructive. I feel so bad for this forest. We did this on purpose, and all these big trees are going to survive. And these big trees all survived a fire in 2008. And 9 years later, we lit this from the top. We let the fire back down through all this deadened down. But we can't just be triggered and see this and be like, oh my God, destruction, oh, the bunnies, yeah. A little less dramatic, but on the same outing. This is burning in black oak stands and white oak too, Oregon white oak. This is lower complexity, it's flatter. We're just burning a lot of the oak litter, and the point here is conifers with fire suppression have encroached into our oaks all over. Meaning that fires like this, low intensity fires, kill little baby fir trees and little baby pine trees, and then the oaks can, resprout. And so over time, if you look at the right hand side of the road here, see all these little spindly fir trees. And so this area got thinned, and then we burned it to kill kind of the new fir trees that are coming in. So there's a lot of opportunities to do stuff like this in Forest Ranch, Cohasset, places we got black oak, which is a lot of places that people live in the Sierra Nevada. And this can be simple. This doesn't, you don't have to have hundreds of people or millions of dollars to do something like this. But all this stuff kind of sets the context for this fire here that's burning the Boise is that when we talk about the locals having a say in the tactics, the locals have an understanding of like, hey, we want moderate severity backing fire because we want to kill encroaching conifers in the tan oak stands, or we want to stimulate the huckleberry or the mushrooms, the tan oak mushrooms, or whatever else. So one of the reasons that the locals in the Klamath can really kind of advocate for the kinds of outcomes they want is because they know what to ask for. They spend a lot of time learning about what they want. I see someone saying more money is spent on fire suppression in the Klamath than any other forest in the nation, and I believe it. And I got to say that this is a lot of this fire that is going right now is happening on the Six Rivers National Forest. They also spend a ton of money on fire, but last year it was really interesting to look at. We had these lightning fires that were burning and being managed on the Six Rivers, and Six Rivers National Forest supervisor, they report the same regional forester, but on the Klamath versus the Six Rivers, there was this kind of really schizophrenic difference in the messaging, where the Six Rivers was actually publishing like, hey, we're using fire for resource benefit, we're lighting things on fire on purpose, we're maximizing the acres that we can burn under beneficial conditions. And the Klamath was saying, we're using a full suppression strategy, we're putting out everything, we're not managing these fires, we don't want you to think we're managing these fires. Because the Klamath, the politics of Siskiyou County are so radically different from the politics of Humboldt County. So the divide between the Klamath and the Six Rivers, I'm pretty sure is right up here up the Salmon River. So coming back to this fire, we talked about how they might start lighting out ahead of it. It's likely that they're not going to contain the fire at the top of the ridge here. Just when we talk about fire history, we see that oftentimes fires get over the ridge. So like the Perch Fire last year, it got over the ridge. It started kind of down here, went over the ridge. In large part because when the fires do finally make their runs up out of here, they tend to spot. And when they spot over the top, they spot into like really, really difficult country like this, where it's almost impossible for ground troops to get into them, and helicopters can kind of knock them down. But unless you can get a crew to run in, to get in there and like line it and snag it and everything else, it's really difficult. So I think kind of right off the bat, folks don't necessarily expect that the fire is going to be held on this this ridge on Orleans Mountain. So what we got over here to the south is the Red Salmon Complex, which burned in 2020. This is a big fire. This fire also had a lot of real mixed severity, meaning that if you turn off and look at like the results, there's some places where everything's burnt, and there's other places where it's kind of mixed, and then there's some places within that perimeter where you can hardly even tell anything happened. And it comes back to what we've said before about like not assuming that like you see a fire perimeter on a map and you assume that there's like this monolithic effect, that everything that's inside that perimeter got nuked and like there's no trees growing there. And it's really not the case just about ever. You'll have days or weeks on big fire like this where things really run. And we looked at like the effects from the Mill Creek fire, or the park fire in Mill Creek, and it nuked like 15,000 acres or something. But that's like 3 days, and then it lays down, and then you get kind of a mixed severity. But one thing we know about fires here is that oftentimes trees that survive a fire will survive the next one. So if you look over here, like Perch Creek, if you come over the top here, it's like, okay, well, there's a fire in 2006 that burned up and out, the Somes fire, and it backed down this side, and most of the big trees survived. And then the Butler fire burned some of the same area, and those trees survived. And then the Perch fire burned in there again. And so just talking a little bit about like fire history. I was looking at a paper real quick here by Carl Skinner and Alan Taylor, who are kind of two of the gurus of fire ecology. Just been super active in northern and especially northeastern California, looking at fire scars. And so they've gone out and they've gone into clear cuts and cut like hundreds of cookies, slices off of big stumps that had fire scars in them. And then they've gone through and they've done what's called dendrochronology, where you take all the scars and you line them up and you graph them out and you figure out like what year they happened. Oftentimes on a stump, you don't know exactly when the tree died, but they do all this work and analyze the rings, and then these are all like places that they had fire scars in their study area. And this is near Hayfork, between 1751 and 1900. And what they found is that there was a fire return interval here of every 11 to 16 years in this country there was fires. And they map out the area where you had a fire scars showed up in all the same stumps, and they said that the median area burned each year was about, or not each year, but in each fire was about 250 acres. 93% of the fires burned in summer or fall. And then they looked at kind of historic fires and what patterns like they followed. And basically they said that like landscape, like fires tended to burn like within a watershed, and oftentimes they would go out when they got to like the toe of a north slope. So if we look at like Butler, it's like the fire stopped at a wet creek, like a riparian area. So what Alan Taylor and Carl Skinner say is like, hey, if we're going to do big landscape scale fires, if we use ridgelines and rivers as our control features, we're going to get like similar fire effects to what we had naturally before suppression. So I think some things, I got a friend who lives, my friend Will Harling, who we've talked about here, his place is right here at the mouth of Butler Creek. And he's saying, well, hey, I live right here at the bottom of the hill, but I want this fire to come over the top and burn down behind my house, and then, put it out when it gets down to the Salmon River. Because he's saying, well, look, this burned 13 years ago. It burned 11 years ago, right? And it's in that interval where it's like naturally we've had fire here every 10 to 15 years. So it's a great time for this to burn again, because that's natural. That's the way it's always worked. And it's summer, but that's when we've had fires. So the puzzle for the folks here on the incident command team is figuring out what they're going to do. How are they going to? Dang. All right. Sorry about that map. I should just, I need someone to have the map switch. Yeah, Butler, it burned down the bottom and then it didn't spread, right? So that's a challenge here. This area here, the Butler fire, it's been 11 years since it burned. It's a good time for the fire to get back in there. So what are we going to show next here? Got some more videos. I'm going to take a minute to fiddle with my audio because I want to play a video from the Karuk Tribe. So I'm going to do that while you guys look at this video. I'm going to try to cue up this movie here. You guys hearing music on there? If you can hear music now, I want someone give a comment. Cool. All right. All right. Should be good. All right, just bear with me, we're getting there. All right, yeah, so we got the music's from the Avant-Gardeners.
A little drums now. Can you feel it?
All right, we're getting there, folks.
Here we go, kick it.
I just gotta find the movie I was gonna play y'all.
Hey, sit up quick, you won't miss a link. Just get into the groove and let your backbone slip. So very, very funky, make it get on down. Do a fucking strut, let's walk it on down, walk it. James Brown.
All right, so this is a movie that is
We live in a
produced.
fire-dependent system, and fire's been part of this landscape, whether it be culturally started fires or natural ignitions.
By the Karuk, it's the
For thousands
Karuk
of
Tribe
years.
made this movie.
And with the more Western influence of fire suppression over the last 100 years, we've kind of got things out of kilter.
Karuk people have been burning for over 10,000 years. The outcomes of those burns are something that they depend on for their survival and for their personal well-being.
You know, we're trying to burn off these areas so they don't burn later. We're not trying to like defer the risk into future years.
Over time, I've come to realize that in a lot of cases, keeping a fire perimeter as small as possible, which we define as success, wasn't always successful.
I think what this incident shows is that given the right conditions and the communication that happened during and the right folks involved, that you can successfully pull off an incident of this magnitude and of this type.
All right, so I'm gonna play this. It's about a 15-minute video, and this relates directly to the Boise Fire because this happened last year, and this is about the management of the Perch Fire and also of some fires that burned farther to the west of Orleans. And so this whole area here in blue burned in last year, and some of the video you're going to see is of how they lit this. We talked about how the tribe and other folks got involved and they lit this strategically. The fire got established here right next to town of Perch Creek, and they strategically kind of decided how they were going to fight it. Dang. All right. Sorry. Perch Fire last year. This movie's about how this fire got fought, how the community got involved, and it's also about how the incident command team is learning to deal in this environment with locals that have opinions, that have knowledge. And so Karuk Tribe produced this video. We're going to play it, and then we'll talk a little more. But I just wanted to kind of set the context that it's largely about this patch here that this fire is going to burn into, and the conversations that are happening right now in Orleans around how this fire is going to get managed are including some of the same players. They're bringing in one of the ops guys from last year who was kind of one of the strategic planners who really figured out how to make this happen. It was a team from the Rocky Mountains, the Rocky Mountain Incident Command Team. So we'll play the video and then we'll come back to the maps.
So this year, we weren't sure what kind of fire season we were getting. We had a very wet winter, but we had a really dry and hot late spring and summer. We had a big lightning bust come through in the middle of August and got hundreds of fires started across the North State.
Since there was a lot of local fires already going on, like in Happy Camp and on the Six Rivers, it wasn't like we were getting a bunch of resources. And this kind of was the case for maybe the first week or so. So I remember like going to the briefings and hearing what the fire's doing, and then coming and meeting with the neighborhoods and the community liaison program.
True to form, the town stepped up, as this town does. You know, neighbors looking after neighbors, and we came up with a plan pretty quickly of what needed to happen there. We just didn't have the resources to do it.
The different local crews were starting to work on the hand lines that eventually kind of became this like, okay, we're gonna probably have to come to a point where the fire gets closer. We're gonna start burning off these lines to like put a buffer between neighborhoods and the fire. This team eventually started getting a spike camp over here in Orleans.
So as we were looking at our response strategy, we were implementing a process, and that process was the ISAT process, strategic risk analysis process. And when we were talking with our teams that were coming in, we were including our partners in those discussions, our key partners, and the tribes are our key partners in that. We bring all those relationships that we had before into play, and we worked our way up to a place where we have a memorandum of understanding in place. And it's a process for when we do have these events, we bring in some of those folks that are really knowledgeable. And we were looking at what opportunities we had and what challenges we had and what was being threatened in terms of values. It's kind of looked at as shared stewardship and shared risk taking. The chief's letter of intent really looks at a number of things, and one of those things it looks at is not deferring risk. So here was that opportunity for us that allowed us to keep people safer, but it also allowed us to suppress the fire, but it's just not the same way as you normally would in terms of trying to go direct.
It was the safest thing we could do for the values that were at risk and the firefighters. The least risk is when you're not exposing people to direct fire operations.
our community, we're not afraid of fire. It's like you were used to fire. We've been doing this for a long time, thousands of years actually. And it's like, if any place where we can do fire and bring fire into the community, it's going to be this community right here.
When we did the firing on the perch, and when that happened and it was like things were a lot safer, people in the neighborhoods were like, when we do more firing, like people were asking for it. People were just asking for it. And what made it possible was the fact that this community and this area were already like prepped socially in a way that they also wanted this. And then of course it was like, this is like burning weather now. We should take advantage of this.
We understood what the common practice was culturally. The difference was we had a large workforce that could do it at a much larger scale.
Okay, yeah, I'm just sitting here next to it.
One of the bigger challenges that the incident command team faced was the hero mentality, or the we're here to save the day, or we're here to put this fire out and go home. It's their foundational belief system, right? And so you don't just break that down overnight.
Part of the trick here was getting our own workforce to be accepting of this. We're built to put in and trained to put fire out as quickly as possible in as small as a perimeter as possible. That's the culture of fire suppression. The shift in thinking that's required to do this is difficult when you have a whole bunch of people that have been trained more or less the same, generation upon generation.
And so one of the big challenges was helping to get the message at all levels of the organization so that everybody understands the why behind what we're looking at and how we're looking at achieving that. And so that was one of the things that took us a little bit longer. We would have likely been able to start implementing a little bit sooner if we were more effective and ready for those types of conversations.
It was the right group of personalities and people to be able to move from thinking about suppressing fire to actually actively managing fire on the landscape.
What everybody was able to capture was, a prescribed fire-like fire behavior and fire characteristics, because that really was our goal.
Many of those ridge lines hadn't seen fire for 100 years, 125 years. And so a few of them got hot on the ridge lines. But it turns out you still have a green canopy. And we got good fire on the ground. It's more than anybody's pulled off around here in a very, very long time. We can do a lot more than that.
If we don't take advantage of situations like this to get fire in a managed setting to reduce the current and future risk to these landscapes, we're not going to address the wildfire crisis. I guess if I was going to give any advice or any encouragement, be inclusive. Bring people that know and understand that landscape. Bring in your partners.
When you have managed fires, whatever you would like to call those types of fires, whether it's confined, contain, less than full suppression, it needs to be a piece of our toolbox between our good old-fashioned suppression incident and prescribed fire and then managed fire. It's a multiple-pronged attack that we have to get more good fire back on the landscape. And if those environmental conditions are such that we can be a little on the aggressive side as far as getting good fire back in the landscape, I think, yes, we're going to have to add that to our toolbox more so than we have in the past.
We can't just say we've had a season ending or season slowing event, in August, and so now we can manage this fire differently. What if that kind of year only happens once every 20 years? You're still spending most of your time going in the wrong direction. So we just have to figure out how to talk to each other because if you're talking to each other and creating conflict, you're not going to get to doing. But if you can figure out a way to talk to each other in a way you can say, oh, that makes sense, then you can get there.
Over time, being back to the same place I'd been in the past and just watching the old fire perimeter that I was on threatening the same community, the same town, and realizing that I could have been involved with firing a very low intensity fire where I would modify the fuels between that town that was at risk and my old fire perimeter, and just realizing, you know what, I missed an opportunity. I transferred risk into the future. I'm back here again, doing the same thing. Maybe I need to think differently about how I do it.
Opportunities are always going to be there? No. But even on years where, you're not having such good burn effects, where fire danger is a lot higher, a local team can still manage and still take advantage around the corners and around the edges. There's always opportunities. Being in a position to take advantage of those opportunities is what it's about.
All right. So, yes, let me share the link to this film. So this was created by my friend Stomi Staats, and she's a filmmaker who lives in Orleans, and there's actually a picture of her in there, like holding her baby, looking at the fire up on the hill. But Karuk Tribe has got some great videos about what they're up to, with all sorts of different things that they're doing with land management over there. But I just actually saw that one that we looked at today. And it's so place specific, Orleans, the Klamath, they've spent decades building that story where kids, have been over there working on prescribed burns, and we've got the elementary school out there, and there's 30 kids standing around watching us burn, or they're doing a workshop on acorns while we're burning. So it's a longer term prospect, but I think these guys, they provide an interesting example, and like we've talked about, they've got basically this these opportunities baked into their landscape because they've had so much fire that they've got a different context. And so when we talk about a little more about fire history, this is just here the last 20 years. If we turn on all of our fire history and we zoom out a bit, let's just look at the whole state. Here we got the Klamath, we've got the puzzles complete for the most part. And like this fire we're talking about, the Boise Fire, it's filling in a puzzle piece. But then you come over here to say like Bernie and Montgomery Creek and everything, and it's like, why did the Dixie Fire get to be 1 million acres? Well, it's like, look at this area here. There's 540,000 acres of almost contiguous land that has had no fire history for 100 years, except like a little fire here. And if we look back, if we say, okay, well, let's disregard fires that are like less than like 50 years old, just, it's easy to see these chunks that like where you're going to have the next, 150,000 acre fire. And that's the story of the Dixie here. If you look at Dixie, before before and after. Like, it burned this huge area that just hadn't had fire history. So the scary spots, and the spots you're not going to pull off an Orleans-style approach to letting fires burn and having the community come say like what they want, is like the Yuba River, right? Like, if we look at the fire history here in the Yuba River since the 1980s, like the whole North Fork of the Yuba hasn't had a big fire since 1987. The Middle Fork of the Yuba and the South Fork of the Yuba. Like, basically, these are the areas that there's a lot of money being spent right now on fuels work, but if you start a fire at 49 and go up to La Creste, La Sierra, like that's a 250,000 acres. Same thing here. And so there's no one's really suggesting that we use managed fire on landscapes like this where you've got such high potential for something to get away and burn 300,000 acres. Around Georgetown, you get down here into like the McCullamy, down in Stanislaus. Like, we've had huge fires in the Sierra in the last decade, really, that are filling in the gaps. You know, the Creek Fire, the Rim Fire, Caldor Fire. But in between, you have these these huge chunks that haven't burned, and so those right now are the obstacle to letting fires burn in the backcountry. Because what we've seen, like with the Bear Fire, was that fire up here around Orville. It was kind of a low priority because there were a lot of other fires going on, and it was achieving beneficial effects for a couple of weeks, burning up here in the Middle Fork Feather. And then in early September of 2020, we got this huge wind event, and this fire blew up and it burned 35 miles down to Lake Orville, burned up Brush Creek and Berry Creek. And so things like that, when those happen, those, like, an entire generation of fire management officers in the Forest Service are not going to let lightning fires burn up here where an east wind, like if you have a fire that's burning well and doing good stuff in August, you're still going to put it out because you remember that in September we had this big sustained east wind push that blew the fire 25 miles. So that pretty much puts the ixnay on like managing fires on the Tahoe National Forest or on the for most of the lower elevations of the Sierra Nevada. The Stanislaus is getting away with managing some fires up in the high country, in large part because either they've got things like the Rim Fire, or they'll have fires that burn up here that are kind of already contained by granite when they start. So you can manage a fire up here because it's 100% contained by granite before it even starts. So the Klamath is a little unique in the kind of built-in patterns of the landscape that they have to work with to do this kind of thing. But things like the Dixie are creating opportunities to do this in places like Quincy. Like if you look around here around, say, Indian Valley in Greenville, like this entire slope up here burned with high severity, the upper slope during Dixie. So you got this great opportunity right now to do, like, you could do prescribed burns right behind the community here with really minimal risk of burning up people's places, because for the next, foreseeable future, Dixie completely just nuked this down to bare mineral soil and some standing dead trees. You've got places in Dixie also that burned with a mixed severity that need that return interval now, right? It's like the trees that are here survived Dixie. They need that fire in the next 10 years or so, the next 15 years, because they got reset on their natural fire return interval. And so if we don't get fire into these places in the next 20 years and all this dead material falls down, fire is really the vacuum cleaner of the forest. And you've got this clutter left over from the Dixie fire of all these standing dead trees. And if those all fall down over the next 20 years and brush all grows up and you have a fire, it's going to kill these trees that survived. And that's what happened during the Moonlight Fire here during the Dixie Fire. Moonlight had some refugia, some places where, weren't a lot of them, but some places out here in Moonlight where trees survived in 2007. So if we look back to say 2014, 7 years after the Moonlight Fire, See if it loads up for us. Moonlight was pretty savage, but there were places up here that where trees survived moonlight, and a lot of that was on Forest Service. A lot of stuff that let's just see here. So the yellow is private timberland, and the private timberland after the Moonlight Fire got salvage logged, and so you can see it. You turn it on and off, and you can see like where the private land is. But there are places out here on the Forest Service that survived, but then they didn't get any real sort of treatment, and so a lot of them then burned during Dixie and kind of got smoked. So we kind of have to follow up. You know, a fire like this where the trees survive, it's like, okay, it's reset. It's back to its natural fire return interval, and we can't say that, oh, we can't burn in there because there hasn't been a fire for 100 years, because it's like, oh, no, actually that burned 5 years ago, and these trees all survived. It's ready for another burn in that 10 to 15 year window. But we're not really doing very well at that, in large part because after something like the Dixie Fire, the Forest Service, all they can do is run around and cut down like hazard trees and clean up the mess from the fire. They're not thinking about managing the green forest at all. So that's your basic fire history primer. And just to kind of come back to the park fire, which we're all watching, right? This is all the times that the Issue Wilderness has burned that we have mapping of. So let's just say there were big fires in the Issue Wilderness in the 1930s and earlier. Let me turn off that. (1918) 22,000 acres burned in Cohasset. 1917, 9,000 acres burned out in the Issue Wilderness area. 1926, 11,000 acres burned in Mill Creek Canyon. 1928, 9,000 acres burned in Antelope Creek. 1930, 3,000 acres in Antelope Creek. So that's 30s. That's pre-30s. This is the 30s. This is the 40s. This is the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and then in 1990, the Campbell Fire burned. So at this time, this is one of the biggest fires in California history, 130,000 acres. So, there's a lot of folks saying, "Oh, climate change is the reason that we had the big fire in Issue Wilderness," or and it's true that the weather was hot and dry, and it was the hottest month on record when the fire burned. But here's I'm gonna turn on the fire here, park fire. It's a landscape that's had a lot of fire. So for now, we've got the fire. It's burned up here to mineral. And so the worry, of course, so far so good this week with the fire. Firefighters are making good progress on the fire here with these cooler conditions, and the conditions are going to get a lot better over the next week or so as far as moisture and cooler. And so good odds that their direct attack here on this section of the fire is going to work out. But the worry, of course, is that if it doesn't, there's no recorded fire history in the last 100 years out in here. And what that tells me is, I think we put this fire out, and it's not like the work's over. It's not like we saved Shingletown or Viola or Lassen Park from the next fire, because it's due. We know it's due. And so I think, what they're talking about over in Orleans is like, well, how do we punch holes in these areas that haven't burned for 110 years, and realizing that you might get like what Leif Hillman said in there is like, you're going to get some bad effects if that burns now because it hasn't burned for 110 years. But it's better to burn it right now and have 30% bad effects than wait another 20 years and burn it and lose it all. Because when we look at Mill Creek, I think here's a point that I think is really important. When we look at Mill Creek, people say like you can't burn these areas that have never had fire in them. You have to go in there and thin them first. And that's sometimes just not possible. But when we look at how Mill Creek burned, like everything brown here is like bare, black soil, no trees left standing, right? So this entire landscape just got completely moonscaped because it burned in record heat and record dryness with the wind blowing up the canyon. And if we would have come in here and burned it from the top down in the fall, we might have killed 20% of the trees. We might have killed 30% of the trees. We might have, you might have looked at this and you might have seen some big high severity patches and said, oh my God, you guys killed all that old growth. What a tragedy. But that would have fireproofed. If you had had a fire in here in the last 20 years that looked like the fire that burned over here in Cub Creek, which was also roadless, which also has big trees, which burned from the top down 15 years ago, Mill Creek would have looked, if it looked like this, it probably wouldn't look completely moonscaped now. So we can't let perfect be the enemy of good, And if we're going to put fire in the landscape at the scale that's necessary to protect the landscape from looking like this, like it's not going to be, prescribed fire is not a precision tool. But there's a real difference to the fire effects you get burning in October than what you get burning in the peak of July. And in these big chunks of land that are completely contiguous, like this west side of Lassen Park, if you don't punch some holes in there and it burns all in July, it's not going to be pretty. So what's to keep us from doing this? Lots. Our agencies are broken. Our ownership patterns are really fragmented. The public isn't interested per se in risk. And there's what they're talking about over here on the Boise is like definitely not without risk, right? They're like, they could just say we're doing everything we can, we're going direct, we're going to keep it as small as possible. And so Nolan Colgrove, the district ranger, he talked about sharing risk. The risk here is that you let it burn. You kind of like the top of the mountain here, you back off, you let it burn, you control the edges that you can, and then in a month you get the big east wind event, and this fire ends up blowing down into Orleans and destroying the town. And that's within the realm of possibility. And so when we talk about shared risk, it's like, well, if the community was part of the decision that we're going to take an indirect attack and try to maximize the amount of landscape, the community is making this value judgment that the trees matter to them, that the mushrooms matter to them, that the huckleberries, the elk, the acorns, all of that matters to the community. The community realizes that without all those resources that they rely on, they can't live there. And so if you see the landscape in that way, your house itself means less to you than your kitchen. If your kitchen and your pantry is this entire landscape, then you're going to take some risks to ensure that it keeps producing, right? That it doesn't burn up and go away. You can't sustain your culture here without fire, and so that's a shared value judgment. Like during the Dixie Fire, there was a firing operation to protect Quincy, and over here, Grizzly Ridge, right? So Dixie burned Dixie was held here along Grizzly Ridge. It burned through Greenville, it burned back through the Moonlight Fire, it jumped Genesee Valley, it took off south, and then firing operations kind of were put into place to keep pace with the fire and keep it from getting over and burning along the Highway 70 corridor. There was no like community conversation about the values that the community wanted. There's an unwritten assumption that saving Quincy was worth burning up the like 50,000 acres to the east side, right? So like we knew that there were strong west winds forecast, but firing operations proceeded here just because there was no way that they were going to let fire get back and threaten the community. And so this firing operation that got lit, it ran like 50,000 acres in a day, and it incinerated like some of the little east side that hadn't burned yet on the Plumas. Now Quincy's a mill town, it's a timber town, and it requires a forest to keep that economy going. But there was no conversation about like, hey, would you rather burn up? Like no one has that conversation. Would you rather burn up most of what's left of the east side forest, or have the fire get down and threaten Quincy again? The team just they just did it, right? So that's that radically different story. Is that like, hey, it's not worth, for the Karuk people, it's not worth living here in Orleans if the forests all burn down, because you're not going to have berries, you're not going to have bears, you're not going to have deer, you're not going to have elk. Sorry, I just got a message from. Is it okay to share the video link on the socials? Yeah, it's on the Karuk Media website, and so my understanding is they put that stuff up there because they want people to see. They want to tell that story, so that's why I'm sharing it. And we're not claiming any credit for that video. We're sharing their story. It's not our story. Oh man. Okay. Well, so that's pretty much the story I want to tell. It's just that there's different ways to think about what's valuable. Chris Waters chimes in here. It's pre-attack planning. Chris Waters is one of the ICs on Dixie. Also prescribed fire boss and big picture thinker. And let me talk a little about planning. One thing that is important about this landscape is that the history of the landscape also defines like some of the potential for fire behavior and some of the constraints, right? So like all these polygons on the map here are former timber harvest. So some of it's thinned in 2003, some of it's clear cuts from the 70s, 72, 69. Over here you got some patch clear cuts from 67. So the values have changed for the Forest Service as well. Right? There was a time when the only way we looked at values on the landscape were the timber values. And so this fire is threatening investments that were made in replanting trees 50 years ago, 55 years ago. This whole landscape had a massive amount of timber harvest, patch clear cutting. This all got clear cut in like the 60s, right? Which is one of the reasons we had a lot of fires here in the 70s and 80s, was we had a lot of slash on these landscapes. Well, I shouldn't say it. We burned a lot of slash on these landscapes, but we had a lot of young stands that were flammable. And so the landscape that we deal with has got this incredibly complex management history, and this management history also shapes how we view values on the landscape from kind of an agency or a national level. Like we say, oh, timber values are threatened. It's evolved a bit where the Forest Service has kind of moved so far away from timber harvest that they're willing to kind of think about things that actually matter to the native people, like, you know, acorns and mushrooms and salmon and elk. Instead of just seeing, for years, the Forest Service really set their priorities based on timber. Anyway, as a map making guy, you're like, man, someone had to digitize all that. I hope they didn't commit suicide. Anyway, that past landscape, you know, the fuelscape we have now is based on stuff that happened over the last 100 years, really. So there's these almost like memes right now, like on Instagram and Facebook, and they're like, burn it, graze it, or log it, graze it, or watch it burn. And it's like, man, that's such an old story. That's such an old polarized view. You know, like, that's something you would have seen on a bumper sticker in like the 1980s. And then when you look at like the Park Fire and where it burned, you're like, oh man, if we log more, we'd have less fires. And you're like, or forest management, right? If we just manage the woods, we wouldn't have these big fires, right? I was like, well, you can't really manage the forest more intensively. I think so. The nuance is lacking. The nuance of that conversation is that fire-informed forest management is what we're lacking. It's not like that we're not. We can't blame environmentalists for shutting down logging and saying that's why we had this fire when it burned. You know, most of the timberland that was burned by this fire is private timberland that's been managed extremely intensely. And then the other land that the fire burned through, like, no one's going to like log scrub oak and manzanita and live oak and chamise and ceanothus. And so this huge area that's been burned here, like, forest management has nothing to do with why Bidwell Park burned or why Chico Creek Canyon. Like, no one's ever logged these live oak forests ever, even before there were environmental laws, because it's just this scrubby, like, maybe cut some firewood there. Mark K saying not even helicopter logging is allowed in wilderness zone. Yeah, and a lot of folks over in the Klamath would have a problem with the whole notion of wilderness, right? The whole notion of wilderness is based on this like European kind of view that like doesn't take into account that like people lived in the wilderness. People have managed the wilderness for thousands of years. There was no wilderness when, like, it's called Ishii Wilderness, but like Ishii was not like he was managing the landscape when he lived there, he and his people. All right. Oh man, people. Running out of gas here, folks. That's the story about fire history. This whole Klamath story is going to unfold. So I think, in general, you know, what we like to do on here is we're telling stories. We're building a language around a place so we can tell stories about that place. So this is kind of your intro to fire ecology of the Klamath Mountains, the social ecology around fire in the Klamath Mountains, and then we're going to keep covering the Boise Fire, and we'll get folks in here to talk about it who are involved, and we're just we're a little scattershot around here. It's like, oh, fire popped up in Alaska County. We're going to go geek out on the fire culture and the decision making in Lassen County, and then we're going to jump over to, oh, that fire's out, time to go to Klamath. So not super linear, but we're trying to build a common language here, and let's lay out a longer term conversation. Waters says all tools have to be available. That includes logging, and we got those. We've talked about it a few times, but if you haven't seen it before, so much of it comes down to conditions. And when we look at our fire severity for the park fire, we talked about how brown is all dead and blue still has trees on it. Like, they did a firing operation here off of Highway 32, not unlike the firing that got done in the Klamath. They just didn't, consult the community and et cetera. They just did a firing operation. But in here, a lot of the land that had been thinned fared really well. So yes, logging for sure. And there's a lot of people who just have this like blanket opposition to logging. And we showed a video on here, and I'll pull it up really quick one more time. That's that we shot out in the park fire a couple weeks ago. This is inside the area we were just talking about that got fired on Park. And this has been logged. And a lot of these trees survived because it had been heavily thinned. When you look at areas out there that didn't have that thick, that didn't get logged, that are thick, they burned. So it's not that the entire landscape needs to look like this, but that things like this create opportunity. And there's folks that say fuel brakes don't work when it's severe weather. It's like, well, yeah, nothing works. But these trees are still standing in their future large forest. I see some comments here about fire in Truckee. Haven't been following that, but I'll take a look real quick. All right. Still got the noise. All right, I was just going to see if I can pull a perimeter for that fire in Truckee. I heard it had been flowing, but I haven't been able to find a map. All right. A squirrel. It's really into biochar. All right. Well, I'm gonna split. Nice chatting with y'all. Thanks for all your comments. Catch y'all later.